Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Iron Rhetoric. The podcast you're about to listen to was recorded on November 26, 2024. Since then, responses to the Antioch statement have been posted by Joe Webbon, the King's Hall, the Ogden Boys, are posting their response on December 6th. Tobias has also released his official statement as of Wednesday, November 27. See the description of this podcast for links to these items. It is our prayer here at the Iron Rhetoric Studios that the listener would listen to the scriptures and sound wisdom. We encourage our listeners to seek out the truth themselves in finding the truth. Keep the scriptures at the forefront and remain faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Enjoy this week's episode as Pastor Bret and Matthew Smith begin Fisking, the Humanist Manifesto III.
When there's nothing left but the fire in my chest and the air that fills my lungs, I'll hold my tears and
welcome to Iron Rhetoric with your intrepid host, Pastor Bret McAtee. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own.
Hello, whatever time of day it is that you're listening. We welcome you to Iron Rhetoric, where I drop what I hope are pearls of insight and wisdom. You can decide for yourself whether or not that's the case, but we make an effort here. We're very thankful for this opportunity to reach out with our ministry in this way. We're thankful for the technical help that we have in Matt Smith. And also, not only Matt gives the technical help, which this couldn't be done without, but Matt, I'm encouraged by Matt because he's a guy who pursues truth. He likes to try to do all that he can to ferret things out, to look underneath rocks, to pull a thread to see where it goes. And I always appreciated those kinds of people because really they're not that common. I mean, most people aren't into investigating, but I'm especially respectful of people that work 40, 60, 80 hours a week, whatever it is, but still somehow manage, despite the demands of the workplace upon them, still manage to spend the time they can to try to figure things out and to try to look behind the curtain, so to speak. So with that in mind, Matt's going to give us some context of the recent hubbub that's everybody's all at Twitter about. The word is the kerfuffle that's occurring now in Reformedom over the whole Joe Webbon and Tobias, Riemen, whatever, some German chap. It's now evolved into the Antioch Declaration, although those who put out the Antioch Declaration swear up and down that the Antioch Declaration doesn't have anything to do with the whole Webbon affair. That's a separate piece. I don't know, you get pretty cynical at this point because it ends up being the same players, and so you have to ask yourself, is that really the case? We had an idea. Let's put out this Antioch Declaration, and it's completely something different from what this ongoing thing we're having with Webbon and company is. So we'll have some more to say about the Antioch Declaration. I spent 4 hours on the evening it came out. It dropped about, 3 or 4 p.m. I didn't get to it until probably 8. I was up till 1, I think it was, furiously writing to repudiate the Antioch Declaration. So what Matt and I are going to try here, something kind of unique, is that we're just going to he's going to give us, like I said, the context, and then we're just going to have kind of a riff back and forth discussing that, because I have read some about it, but I think Matt knows the context probably better than I do. I'm familiar with the players, and I've followed it somewhat. So we'll turn it over to Matt, and he can give us some context, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation, and I think that'll segue into looking at this Antioch Declaration, which I'm calling the Humanist Manifesto III. Others have likened to the Barmen Declaration that came out in the late 30s in Germany. We'll talk a little bit about that That's funny. If you know what the Barmen Declaration is, that's funny. If you know what the Humanist Manifesto is, that's funny, or at least it's an attempt to be funny. So, Matt, why don't you go ahead and give us the context?
All right. So after, several months, there's a gentleman who had moved here to the United States from Germany and joined Joe Webbon's church. And there were pastorally some things that were concerning to Pastor Joel regarding certain questions. This gentleman's opinions towards a certain bagel people group. I'm censoring myself to avoid any takedowns from YouTube or Spotify.
We'll just use the word bagels.
Yep. Regarding bagel questions and attitudes in regards to the bagel people group, and certain opinions regarding World War II happenings, centering around the personal beliefs and political beliefs and or practices of Adolf Hitler,
otherwise known as that mustache guy from Austria, Corporal
9.
His name, let me insert here. His name probably should have been Schickelberger, because his father was, so some biographers suggest his father was born illegitimately, and his father's last name should have been Schickelberger, because that would have been the mustachioed corporal from Austria's grandfather was a Schickelberger. Okay. But that was covered up, as these kind of acts often were when they're illegitimate. And she married a chap named, the 2-syllable word that starts with H. We already said, so we'll say it again. And she married a chap named Hitler, and so Adolphus got the name Hitler. And I've always thought that funny. I read a biography by John Tolan of Hitler back when I was 23, 24. It was just after college, I remember. I don't know why I remember so clearly, but I remember. And when I came across that part, I thought, this is hilarious, because while Heil Hitler works, it's hard to imagine tens of thousands, 100,000s of people walking into a room and saying, Heil Schickelberger. So anyway, that's an addition for this portion.
Gesundheit. Reminds me of the old one of the old Rankin Bass Christmas cartoons about Kris Kringle. The Burgermeister Burger.
Anyway, back to the Webbon affair.
Anyway, this particular parishioner seemed to be exhibiting some things that were, let's say, on the sinful side. And Joel was working with his parishioner to try to talk him off a ledge, so to speak. If you're a pastor in the audience, I'm sure you've had to do that a time or three with members of your own congregations. No, it just happens. And then sometimes it might be you that needs to be talked off a ledge.
Matt speaking from personal experience here.
I'm not necessarily talking about you.
But you could be. Just to say I'm a ledge kind of guy, so it's okay.
Right. So, and in the midst of all this, this parishioner was also talking to his former pastor, Tobias. I'm not sure what R German something is his last name.
Yeah, it's like Riemenschneider. That's not it, but it's something like that.
And
just remember Tobias.
And James White, if you're listening to this, no, we're not trying to mock it. We didn't. I really don't know how to pronounce his name. I've heard it pronounced. I look at it. I can't do it. So I apologize. Get off your high horse already.
And James, if you're listening, man, we're humbled. Thanks.
So anyway, and this person was going back and forth with his former pastor, Tobias, in Germany. He's a Reformed Baptist pastor. And there are some things in that conversation, his former pastor also found concerning. Fair. But it got to the point where certain things where it felt like the opinion was Joel wasn't doing enough regarding this parishioner. And instead, not doing enough in this respect. He wasn't moving toward excommunication quick enough. And what really came to a head is a meme was shared by this parishioner to his former pastor Tobias, and another close friend. This other close friend was also a member of Joe Webbon's church, if I remember correctly. The meme in question, it's like a Norman Rockwell 1950s mom and daughter working together in the kitchen making dinner or pie or something.
Cookies.
They were making cookies. And the daughter in the meme says, "Mom, what's the Holocaust?" And the mom responds, it's the one time bagels had to work and they claimed it killed them. Now, for anybody who follows any sort of revisionist history, there's a bit of chuckle in that. For some people, that's not funny at all, and that's just fine. Anyway, this turned into, essentially, we got to have a phone call. So they met, actually, if I remember correctly, it was before this meme was initially shared. They had this huge phone call between Tobias, the parishioner, Webbon, and a couple other witnesses, essentially. And it came out that Tobias, at the behest of Wilson, Doug, that is, James White, Joe Boot, Tobias named them specifically, that Joel essentially was a target regarding these views, regarding these situations, regarding views of the bagels. Because according to Tobias, the parishioner, his views regarding bagels and World War II changed more after going to Webbon's church. Now, a lot of these things Joel has not spoken as far as his position on the bagels and World War II. He has not really given his full explanation of his views on this. He's kept them quiet, and to a certain extent, I don't blame him. And that's his prerogative. If he chooses to share that, that's fine. If he doesn't want to, that's fine too. But the parishioner said, since he goes to church, his views has changed. And then, but the phone call quickly devolved away from the parishioner and saying, you got to excommunicate him. And it turned into a direct attack against Joel Webbon. How these ideas are bad, these are dangerous, and so on.
All right, let me just insert here. First of all, we have to allow it for people's sense of humor. Different people have different sense of humor. I have a very dark sense of humor, and it got me into a boatload of trouble 2 or 3 years ago. I won't go into the details, but I posted something and said something that people took incredible offense of, but I just thought it was funny in a dark humor kind of way. I can even say what that was. There was, I think I posted a link to a story where somebody knocked off his wife because she backtalked him, or she sassed him, or she spoke against him, or something like that. And it just struck me as funny as, well, I guess she'll never do that again. And that leaked out to some powers that be in the denomination I was formally but not really associated with. And of course, they were looking for a reason to take offense, and it caused me all kinds of headaches. And so the meme that the chap posted, if you have a dark sense of humor, I don't see any problem with it. It's people making a mountain out of a molehill. And then when you add to the fact that he sent it to 3 people on a text, 3 people he thought were his friends. So, the idea was, here, I'll send this to my friends. I'm certainly not going to get my hand caught in the cookie jar if I send it to my friends. And one of his friends was the German pastor named Tobias, and who did not think it was funny in the least. And for additional context here, you have to understand that if Tobias is in Germany, you can get put in jail for saying this kind of stuff. I don't know if they would go as far as if you're receiving it, what they would do. I don't know the answer to that. But David Irving, for example, was put in jail in Germany for a while for writing some of the stuff that he wrote about the bagels. The second thing we would add here is there is such a thing called revisionist history. Revisionist history is identified as looking at something that has supposedly an established narrative that is the widely accepted narrative, usually is penned by the court, what we call the court historians. Court historians means that they're on the payroll of people that have an interest in a certain narrative being spun. And so the court historians spin this narrative, and what revisionist history does is it comes along and it looks at it and says, I don't think so. There are a lot of things here that aren't being taken into consideration. Now, I was a history major in undergrad, and it just so happens that I did a ton of reading in undergrad on the World War II official court historian narrative. And then after I graduated from undergrad, and even after I graduated from seminary, because I was busy reading a lot of other stuff at the seminary besides that, after that, I started reading more and more of the revisionist stuff. So I think I've read pretty well on both sides, and I'm convinced that the revisionist historians need to be listened to, and so does the chap who got in trouble for sending the text. Now, I don't know how far off the ledge he was. I don't know what he was saying, but it sounds to me like what Webbon was doing is he was trying to say, okay, you have these views about what happened in history, and we need to at least have a conversation about some of these views.
Yep. And also in the midst of all this, because I initially heard Webbon's webcast saying that he had to come public with some of this information. He had like a 2.5 hour episode on his show about the situation. And when Tobias published his episode, his debut podcast through Eschatology Matters at the time, this was within the past couple months, he said that Joel was the one that made it public, which is a lie. Because what had happened, Tobias talked to his buddies, White and Wilson and Boot, about the situation. Well, scratch that. I'm not going to say he talked to Joe Boot about the situation directly, because I don't know. Because I don't know any of Boot's public comments regarding this situation. But both Wilson and White both did I'm going to use Dr. White's word, webcasts. You know, if you're old and you don't know, and you still use chat channels. That was a nerd joke.
My son-in-law will get it.
But essentially, both White and Wilson talked about this meme and saying how in certain Reformed churches, this is creeping up and we need to put the kibosh on it. Publicly discussing this thing, and for those who are close to the situation, know exactly what they're referring to, even though the general public may not have at the time. So it was after these things. Oh, and also, if my memory serves, Tobias also was on Iron Sharpens Iron radio show, naming Webbon directly, and the Ogden Boys, Stephen Wolfe, and a couple others. How all these people are dangerous, etc. And then fast forward even more, came out that Tobias came out. For those in the know, they put the kibosh on it, saying, look, he lied, and here's how he lied, and here's where he lied. Eschatology Matters removed Tobias' podcast from their feed and issued a statement saying, essentially, yeah, we're sorry for not vetting that closer initially. And to my knowledge, the episode has not been republished, unless it's still in the Fight Laugh Feast podcast podcast playlist somewhere.
We should note here that the reason this got leverage, this whole issue, is that there was a phone call that happened between Webbon and Tobias. Was there anybody else on that phone call?
Yes, that particular call was Tobias, the parishioner, Webbon, British gentleman who was, I think, there with Tobias. I think maybe one other.
Okay, and the reason that Tobias got his hand caught is that this was recorded, and one unfortunate aspect of this is that I don't think that Tobias knew that this was being recorded, and so, I guess if I'm being recorded, I guess I would like to know, but I'm also going in to these. If it was this kind of a conversation, I'm going in assuming that I'm going to be recorded. I'm at least going to explicitly ask, am I being recorded? Because as everybody knows, privacy is it's just a joke.
And I also saw it confirmed today via X. Well, we can't call it Twittering about, mind you. It's called Xing about now because it's not Twitter anymore. Right. It's X. So Xing about. It was been confirmed that the parishioner is the one that recorded the call because he did not trust Tobias.
And the reason I'm laughing is now we know why.
And this is from Webbon's X post, one of Webbon's X posts. I did not think to bookmark it. Yeah. Anyway, and all this is going on, and then you get nothing but radio silence from Tobias. Well, one, he had several big events over a course of a week, a couple weeks, a couple conferences and things like that. Taking care of guests, flying in and out. So I get it. You're busy. I wouldn't knock you for that. However, regarding this situation, this is something. Well, men, if you did something stupid, it's much easier and faster to repent and ask for forgiveness. It's much slower and more difficult to double down. And that appears to be what's been happening. Because White and Wilson both, I've seen more of White stuff, how the hammer has to come down on this stuff. And we got to sit down and shut up and wait. Actual quote from White, mind you. Shut up and wait. No, until the man comes out with a statement. So we're promised Tobias is going to come out with a statement. And then out of nowhere, boom, we get a declaration.
Yeah.
The Antioch Declaration.
Which fits hand in glove with everything that's going on. It's hard to... I note that because the chaps that put it out are insisting that the Antioch Declaration has nothing to do with the Webbon affair. That's a completely different piece. But the timeline is awful suspicious in all this, and so as we look at this, I want to start off by saying, and I'll probably repeat myself later on this score. You have to understand that if ever there is a incident where propaganda is hottest, it's during war. Okay, matter of fact, there's an old proverb. Most of you already know it. It is that truth is the first casualty of war, right? And so I mention that because you can't just take the official narrative, which is born of the propaganda, and just own that and take it as if that's the gospel truth. And they've got away with this ruddy behavior now ever since the end of World War II up until 10 years ago, maybe even only 5 years ago, maybe even more recent than that. Now, there's always been people that have popped up their heads, but we're at the point now where it's not just a matter of some solo chap popping up his head. It's almost becoming a movement of people questioning the World War II narrative. I mean, you have people like, and you should look these guys up. You should read them. There are books out there. They do websites, or some of them are deceased, but some of their websites are still up. Ernst Zundel was tried in Canada over these issues. I don't know if they called him hate crimes then, but it was something similar. He ended up in the long run being extradited back to Germany because Zundel was a German, and he was put in prison there for a while. But the Canadian trial made all kinds of news, and there were books written. Zundel had websites. I've read the books. I've looked at the websites. I've listened to the lectures. He's just one guy. David Irving is a second guy. You should read Churchill's War. One mega volume probably over 1,000 pages, but supposedly there's a second volume coming out. And then he has, that's Hitler's War. That's one volume. Churchill's War is 3 volumes. That's it. And there's another subsequent volume on Hitler's War that's supposed to come out. But Irving goes into these facts, and Irving doesn't go into them. I don't get the sense that Irving is a wild-eyed lunatic. I mean, he's just saying, look, I've looked at all the documents. I've been in the archives, and the post-war narrative just doesn't stand up. And of course, they put David Irving in jail. They took him to trial. They sued him for every cent he was worth and then some. But the man still keeps going. And I hope that he's able to finish the second volume of. I'm pretty sure it's the second volume of Hitler's War. I've already paid for it. I'm just sitting here waiting for it to come. So you have Ernst Zundel. You have David Irving. There's all kinds of stuff. As a matter of fact, you can look on Iron Ink for a reading list on this subject. Maybe we'll post it so that you can have access to it. But the fact of the matter is all because somebody questions the narrative of World War II, questions the number of people that perished in the Holocaust. And by the way, does it really matter if it was 6 million or 3 million in terms of it being egregious? I mean, can't we be just as saddened over the fact that maybe it was 2 million as opposed to 6 million? There's also a documentary out that everybody should should view. It's called, if you can find it, it's called 2/3 of a Holocaust. It's about, 4 or 5 hours long. It's long. I've watched it a few times. But again, all this documentary does, it's not wild-eyed fanaticism. All it does is it raises a question. It raises questions. Was it really possible to turn all 6 million bodies, or whatever the number might have been, into ash in crematoriums? Would not that burning process have somehow been noticed? Were there really such things as traveling gas chambers? It questions the eyewitness accounts and just looks at the eyewitness accounts and questions and basically says, is that really possible? So that's another piece of information I would encourage people to consider as they're looking at this question of the post-World War II narrative. Also, another thing that needs to be kept in mind here as we're discussing this is that you can look at online, you can find this, I'm sure. It's interesting that the 6 million number becomes a Gollum number. Because you can go back to the beginning of the 20th century and you can track in major outlets of media sources, and the media has always had a bagel control to one degree or another. But you can go back to as early as 1900 forward, all the way up into the war, and you can find the 6 million number being repeated over and over and over and over and over again. There are 6 million bagels in Europe. There are 6 million bagels in Russia that are in danger. There are 6 million, and the 6 million numbers there over and over and over again. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? Why is it the number 6 million always, all the time? Then you have to consider the idea that when you look at the memoirs of de Gaulle, the memoirs of Churchill, and the memoirs of Eisenhower, for example, which together are thousands and thousands of pages, guess what you don't find in any of those memoirs? You don't find the Holocaust. right? You don't find this mention. It was only after, it was in the early 70s when this meme really began to pick up steam, and you have a chap named Finkelstein who wrote a small volume called The Holocaust Industry. And Finkelstein, who is bagel himself, insists that basically they're making cash on creating this narrative. Then you have to add in the fact of all the stories about making lampshades out of human skin and making soap out of human fat, bagel fat and bagel skin, later to be found out to be completely ludicrous. And yet when I was an undergrad and I took a whole semester course on the Holocaust and did a lot of my reading there, that was in what we were learning, all right? Then you combine the fact, of course, you see all in the films, all these emaciated bodies when the Allies show up to free these concentration camps, these stalags. And I don't have any doubt that there was rough treatment of prisoners there, but you have to understand that because of the Allied bombing, and because of the Allied making war on the Reich, that the last people who are going to be fed at that point is who? Prisoners. And so it would be a shock to find them not in that condition. I mean, keep in mind what they found in Andersonville at the end of the War of Northern Aggression. The South, the only chap who was executed was the commandant, a guy named Wirt, W-I-R-T, I think was his name. He was executed, and he was the only Southerner that was executed at the end of the War of Northern Aggression. But again, they had all these Yankee prisoners. They didn't have a lot of resources. They were putting them in Andersonville. The South itself was starving. Well, who are you going to starve before you starve yourself? Obviously, again, prisoners of war. So the same type of thing was happening there in Germany. Now add this layer to this whole mix. Add to the fact that nobody's told about James Bacque's book and his work, Other Losses, and there's another book that he wrote with the word Mercies in it. I can't remember the title of that book. But James Bacque, B-A-C-Q-U-E, and you can find interviews with him on YouTube. He demonstrates that the Allies had their own Holocaust. It didn't hit 6 million people, but what they did is, in order to get around the Geneva Convention on prisoners of war, they called them unarmed or disarmed prisoners or unarmed prisoners or something like that. They didn't put them under the category of POW, because if they put them under the category of POW, they had to treat them a certain way. But if they put them in this other category called unarmed combatant or something like that, then they didn't have to treat them with the demands of the Geneva Convention. And so what they did is they killed 1 million of these Germans by putting them in loose fencing in an area that could be easily flooded, and these people just basically starved to death. And the guards who were had standing orders to shoot any German civilian that came to the fence to try to pass on foodstuffs to the Germans. And so, again, this is part of the narrative that nobody wants to talk about. Then you have the part of the narrative that it's called the Operation Keelhaul, where Russians that had fled from the communists of the Soviet Union were demanded to be repatriated by Stalin at the end of the war, and Roosevelt and Churchill agreed. And there were people that were being sent back to the Soviet Union that had moved away from there for generations. They had moved away from there in 1918 when the White Russians fought back against them. Well, even these people who had not been in the Soviet Union, had fled the Soviet Union for 20, 25 years, even they were forcefully repatriated. And the Allies knew what was going on. You can read a book by a chap named Tolstoy. No, not the famous Tolstoy. I think it was his nephew. Can't think of his first name. But Tolstoy tells this story of how these people were forced, repatriated back behind communist lines by the Allies, and they knew they were being killed the minute they walked behind the enemy lines. They could hear the report of the firing squads. And the Soviet soldiers who had fled the Soviet Union were so desirous of not going back that they were basically cutting their wrists with glass that they had broken out of the places that they were kept in the Allied camps in order for them not to be forced onto the bus to be taken back. So, I mean, and I've only given you a Whitman sampler. I haven't mentioned the chap. What was the chap's name? The American who was at the Zundel trial. His name escapes me, but he was an expert in capital punishment. And so he was hired to go to Germany to see if any of the chemical residue was still left in these supposed killing showers where they put gas, because the residue would not have gone away because of the life of the chemical itself that would be in the earth and in the rocks below. And he went, and I wish I could think of his name, but he went and he tested, and he found that there was no Zyklon B chemical in the rocks where the supposed showers were built upon, and there was no proof, therefore, that there was Zyklon B that was being pumped. And they also failed to tell you that, Zyklon B, supposedly a killing agent, but Zyklon B was also used to defumigate? That's not, the D isn't from there. Fumigate the prisoner's clothing of lice in a proper amount. So there is so much lying and propaganda going on that it's just stunning that Wilson, White and Company can say in their Antioch Declaration that, oh, this is so obvious. There's so much history. There's so much, and history is science, that it's just unfathomable that we can possibly believe anything but the prevailing narrative. And all this chap did, who got in trouble with Pastor Tobias, that's his first name, all he did is he maybe pressed the envelope a little bit on questioning this narrative that I've just spent the past what, 5 or 10 minutes maybe giving you the highlights.
Well, I want to say, speaking of narratives, because that particular Zoom call went away from discussing the parishioner, but targeting Pastor Joel Webbon specifically, and a certain podcast you were not supposed to name. And I'm going to name that podcast because there's concern. I'm going to borrow from Eddie Robles for any thing. They're concerned, guys. They're concerned. There's so much concern going around. But apparently, Stone Choir podcasts and its hosts are devil incarnate, apparently. This is not something that I've noticed, but apparently, according to those among those concerned, they are. Now, I would say here at Iron Rhetoric, we are not suggesting or suggesting necessarily that, Stone Choir is great. We're not necessarily suggesting that. I would encourage you to listen, make your own judgments. However, but there is a huge target on there's a target on them, but nobody has actually made effort to actually go after them directly. So it's this indirect thing, and it's convenient with going after Joe Webbon because his parishioner listened to much of Stone Choir's content. But also, that being said, Joel also warned his parishioners in a church message digital message board, saying some of what these guys say is okay. Other bits of it are way out there in left field. As your pastor, I'm telling you, exercise extreme caution. Best to stay away from. That was Joel's message to his church members regarding this group. But it's a weird proxy because everybody wants to. Stone Choir recently on Cross Politic, Doug Wilson said mentioned Stone Choir directly and how they're bad and not good.
So what they're trying to do is they're trying to hang the noose of Stone Choir around Webbon's neck.
Yep, and not just Webbon, the Ogden boys as well.
Right, and I've gotten that kind of thing myself. So I have my disagreements with Mahler, and I've even made some of those disagreements public. But again, I would say that Mahler, turnip seed, woe, that some of the stuff they say, as I just said, is too far out there for me. But there's other stuff that I it's just facts. It's inconvenient facts, and they're committing the sin of noticing. And again, I think that at some points Mahler especially has gone too far. But I still think that it can be listened to a discerning person with profit. Now, another part of the dynamic here that we need to mention is, look, one has to do an incredible amount of reading to catch up not only on the official narrative, although that's in the bloodstream. It's easier to get the official narrative. But still, in fairness to the narrative, to the official narrative, you should do your reading. But then also tend to do the reading of the revisionist authors. And again, I want to say that I have done both, and I have read, I bet I could give you 100 books, both on the, not each narrative and revisionist, but total narrative revisionist, that I've read on the events surrounding World War II. And I've read them over the course of, now I'm 65, I started reading this stuff when I was 20. So over the course of 45 years. And you have to be incredibly discerning in order to wade through this stuff. I saw a chap this morning on a social media site going on and on about how obvious it was that the official narrative is right. And he was a young guy. And I just asked him, well, really, can you tell me all the books that you've read? Because you really need to have some kind of anchor beyond just podcasts. And that takes a long time to do. And that's part of the problem, is that you've got these new guys jumping in, and even with Wilson and White and company, and Sandlin and Boot and Durbin, I seriously doubt, I may be wrong, they can correct me, anybody can correct me that knows, I seriously doubt they've done the legwork of doing the kind of reading that's required, especially when they say, again, I know, oh, it's just so obvious. How can anybody even question this? No, it's not so obvious, and it needs to be questioned. And so the other thing that needs to be tossed in at this point is that really what's happening is that we're making an historical narrative, a court historian narrative, to be official dogma, in order to be considered a member in good standing at a Christian church. And that opens up another whole kettle of fish, but I'll pause there.
And so appears to be this proxy war proxy thing being waged against Stonequire, against Mahler and Woe. And for those listening, when Pastor Bret just mentioned turnip seed, he is friendly with those two gentlemen. As far as any official collaborations, aside from like one or two webcasts, I don't think there is any. However, to give you some context there, Turnip Seed was excommunicated from his church not because he sinned, because he would not denounce Mahler and Woe.
Yeah, so what's going on here, and you all have probably already figured this out, but let's just say it explicitly. What's going on here is you've got a handful of guys that are trying to be the gatekeepers. They're trying to say who's in and who's out. This is something that William Buckley did back in the 70s and 80s.
Wilson loves that guy.
Yeah, Wilson was a huge fan of, for years and years, was a huge fan of Buckley. And Buckley was found out later, had ties to the CIA. The thought was that he was a gatekeeper of the conservative movement. He tossed out the Birchers early on. Later, he tossed out Joe Sobran. Later, he tossed out Peter Brimelow. I don't think he had good things to say about Sam Francis.
He went after Buchanan too, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Okay, so he was a gatekeeper. Buckley was saying this is what official conservatism is, and anybody who doesn't agree with me cannot be considered an official conservative. You don't get your membership card, and that's what Wilson is trying to do. He's trying to reincarnate Buckley. And he's trying to suggest that unless everybody toes the line with what he is going to define as conservatism, or conservative Christianity, or in this case, Christianity, unless you're willing to toe Wilson's line, White's line, Durbin's line, Booth's line, unless you're willing to toe that line, you cannot be considered, it may be a bridge too far, but I'm going to say it anyway, you cannot be considered a Christian. You need to be read out of the Christian church. And some of us who have done the work, the reading, highly resent this idea that Doug Wilson is going to take upon himself the ability to be, or James White or any of these guys, to be gatekeeper. Who died and appointed you to be to God over what could and could not be believed? And again, it's not like there isn't lots of revisionist history out here that for example, Percy, what's his last name? Can't remember his last name. He did like 1,000 pages. I've read large portions of it on Pearl Harbor, questioning the whole official narrative there. So, everything surrounding World War II, in my opinion, is up for grabs. You make your argument and you do what you can. But Wilson has developed, there's a phrase I was going to use, I can't use that phrase, a hankering for the bagel narrative of World War II and what's now called the post-war consensus, which I think should be called the post-Enlightenment consensus.
Yeah, most definitely. And with all this, it's good to keep in mind that there's so much more that we could say we could go on. As another aside, it was Wilson that warned Andrew Whisker not to partner with Andrew Torba when he published his book on Christian nationalism. And that's just one small example. Publicly on X, Wilson has said as much. Essentially warned these guys, saying, "No, if you do this, you're not going to be of us anymore. Of us," as if they wanted that in the first place. But anyway, from all this is ultimately this Antioch Declaration when it came out, and to quote a friend of mine. If you read the Antioch Declaration, of the guys who collaborated, Boot, Wilson, Durbin, White, Sandlin. I think it was Sandlin.
I'm pretty sure his name.
Yep. Collaborators. Yep. Joe Boot, Jeff Durbin, Andrew Sandlin, James White, Doug Wilson, Tobias Riemenschneider. I think I said that right. Anyway, if you've actually taken time to read through this statement, it's barely coherent at best. I'm not much of a writer, but the way this is written could have been worded a lot better. I've heard a lot of folks review it, and I've heard someone say Doug Wilson could sneeze out better sentences than this. With how insane it is. Pastor Bret here has referred to it as the Human Manifesto III.
Right, because Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2 are fairly well known, and I was just playing by just trying to find a mocking handle for it. Humanist Manifesto 3.
And the whole thing is centered around a very bad interpretation of a bit in Galatians where Paul says when he was in Antioch stood opposed to Peter at Peter's face because Peter stood condemned in violation of the gospel. Now, what was that violation? That's the question. So if you're familiar with the passage, at least in Galatians, essentially what was going on, Paul was ministering to the Gentiles. Everything was cool. Everything was great. But the Judaizers came to pay a visit. Okay? Peter, instead of standing his ground and doing what he's supposed to do, kind of chickened out, kowtowed to the Judaizers, and kind of you Gentiles go away. You're unclean. Now, this wasn't because, they're racist. No, they're Gentiles and we're Jews. That may have been a small portion of it. But the primary issue here, which is the Galatian heresy, is adding works of the law to justification. Because the Judaizers' position, which very much, if you're familiar with the Pharisaical tradition, which we see throughout the Gospels, was essentially, you want to follow Christ? Well, that's great. Well, you have to do this ritual thing and be circumcised first.
Right. It's actually, I have articles on Iron Ink on that Galatians passage. Actually, and this makes the alienists have heart attacks. But actually, the Galatians situation proves kinism. Because what the Jews were saying, what the Judaizers were saying at that point, was that you have to become cultural Jews in order to be Christian. And Paul was saying, no, you can retain your cultural identity, i.e. eat the foods that you eat, and still own Christ and be considered Christian. And so Paul was, in my estimation, he was saying, he was giving a foundation for kinism there. You don't have to become a cultural bagel in order to become a Christian. You can be the people group you are in the context of God's law, and not, I'm talking about his moral law and the civil law that expresses the moral law. If you keep within those boundaries, you don't have to do the ceremonial bagel thing. And so I find it to be a very kinist account, and that is completely flies in the face of the way that most people want to handle that.
Yeah, in case in point, this Antioch Declaration, this first paragraph, gets this wrong. Because as we discussed, it's not about race, it's about adding works of the law to salvation, to justification. And even in the book of Galatians, Paul gets so irritated with them. Heck, if they're so special because they circumcised, well, they might as well just cut the whole thing off. It's in there, look it up. But the first paragraph of the Antioch Declaration, just as the Apostle Paul at Antioch opposed him, Peter, to his face because he stood condemned, that comes from Galatians 2:11, the CSB, for compromising the gospel of Jesus Christ by subjecting it to racial barriers. So this brief statement opposes the ideas of some contemporary leaders and influencers seeking to introduce anti-gospel racial categories into the church. The Antioch Declaration was not conceived or developed in haste, but after much prayer, thought, counsel, and soul-searching. Insert cheesy sound effect here. No, I'm not actually going to do that. I'm just trying to break in the monotony. Our task is an unpleasant one, but like the Apostle Paul's, it is necessary, even when other Christians are involved. When the gospel, once for all delivered to the saints, is itself at stake, we dare not remain silent. So that's a huge mouthful. But they get they eisegete racial animus into the Galatian heresy when that was not. Well, that may have been part of the issue, but that was not the core of the problem. The core of the problem was adding works of the law. Works of the law not determined by God.
Right. Although I do think there was some racial animus there, though, because they wanted the Gentiles to become cultural Jews, is what they wanted.
Yeah.
But they've got it backwards and upside down at this point, because the effect of what Paul teaches there is that it's okay. You don't have to become a cultural Jew. You can maintain your race, your ethnicity, your Gentileness, as it were, and still be Christian. What these guys are doing is they're the ones that are trying to make it so all colors bleed into one. They want to have this, they want to understand unity in the Church of Jesus Christ to be uniformity. And I'm all about unity. I mean, I've got friends of different ethnicities and different races. We get one of my better friends, one of my Timothys, for example, lives in across the pond, and he's a cultural Westerner, but he would be considered of a different race. I have a chap who's a Filipino that has come to my defense on these kinds of issues. And so Kinists don't want to divide the church. They just want to say uniformity isn't demanded. And that's what we see these proto-cultural Marxists, like the creators of the Antioch Declaration. That's what I won't say we. That's the way I see them, is that they want all colors to bleed into one. And some of the language they use gives me reason to think that.
And so ultimately, now I think at this point, Pastor, I think it'd be great for us to pause because we've been going for over an hour. So if you could close us out.
Sure. So we've been given the highlights, and I think we've done a fairly good job of setting the table of what's happened here. It seems like there's always something new that's being updated. Like I've seen hints online that the Tobias side has more information that kind of negates the information that was put out from the revealed phone call. That's the sense I got. Maybe I'm wrong, but there's still this sense that this is an ongoing thing that's going to change over time. There was also, at one point in the course of the conversation, there was the idea, we need to have an independent judicial body called to look into this and make a decision. And
Baptists were saying that.
Yeah, that's screwy. It's screwy because once you're already up to your neck in the controversy, where are you going to find anybody who's going to be able to be even-handed in dealing with the situation? And so that was. I hope they don't submit to that because that's loopy to begin with. So we tried to give you a context here. We've also gone into some of the issues. We'll go more into the Humanist Declaration and further podcast.
Depends on what kind of boomer you are and how you want to word it.
Yeah.
Radio ministry.
And so we'll look at that in subsequent times together. But we thank you for listening, and we hope that this gives you at least an idea of what's going on, because I'm telling you, this is huge. I mean, this is getting to the point where I think whoever comes out on top is going to be in a good position, and probably it isn't going to be the case that anybody is going to be seen as coming out on top. And I actually am praying that this leads to a split. Now, you might think that's a funny thing for me to say, but the reason that we have unity is because we have an agreement on what the Scripture teaches and what the Scripture says. When we no longer have an agreement on what the Scripture teaches and what the Scripture says, then there needs to be a going of different ways. And I think that's what needs to happen here. I think there needs to be a going of different ways on this particular issue, because it's almost like an Arminian, Calvinist, Paedo-Baptist, Credo-Baptist kind of issue. You either see it or you don't see it, and if you don't see it, it doesn't matter which side you're on, you're not going to be able to understand the other side. And so you say to the other side, well, we can't go with you. We hope that you repent. But we're going to do our thing, and you all go ahead and do your thing, and God will sort it all out in the end. So that's what my prayers are, and we'll give you more information on this in the Antioch Declaration, at least the high points, because there's a lot of mess in there, in future Iron Rhetoric podcasts. We thank you for your time, and pray that you'll continue to do what I admire Matt for doing, and that is try to ferret these things out. God bless, and God be with you.
Oh, brothers, can you hear my voice, or am I all alone? If there's no fire to guide my way, then I will start my own.
Thank you for joining us today. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, like, and share.